Hello, welcome to History 102, Lecture 5, The Progressive Era. In your textbook, in your OpenStax textbook, The Progressive Era is Chapter 21. If you're using the ushistory.org notes, it would be Chapters 43 and 44. The first thing we want to go over is we want to define and go over the origins of the Progressive Era. The Progressive Era is generally considered to be the first 2 decades of the 20th century. Historians separate out a period of the late 19th century where you don't really see societal reform going on, to the first couple of decades of the 20th century, where we see kind of a emphasis on reform. The Progressive Era is generally considered to be a response to Lecture 2, the Second Industrial Revolution, and its effects on society, as well as the development of the middle class. In the late 19th century, America's middle class, you could say, woke up, realized that they were the middle class, and then didn't like what they saw and wanted to reform society. The Progressive Era, the progressive reforms of the early 20th century, are influenced by the social gospel and the populist movement, Lecture 3, the populist movement in the late 19th century. And I believe I mentioned this before in class. Whereas populism is working class, lower class reform, and progressivism is simply middle class reform. And they echo some of the things that were called for by populists. In general, progressivism, as an ideology, believes that its most basic foundation believes in using the power of government to reform society. It gets to the basic question that we deal with as a society is, what is the proper role of government in that society? A progressive individual believes that the government should intervene and should reform society. Progressivism argues that society, human beings in society, are perfectible through government action or reform, meaning that it is possible for imperfect human beings to create an imperfect government, and then somehow that imperfect government creates a perfectible utopian society. Next, progressive ideology focuses more on collective action and rights over individual rights and actions. The most obvious example of this would be gun control. Progressives imagine a right to safety, and so if there's an alleged collective right to safety, that for progressives that trumps an individual's constitutional, God-given right to arm themselves, have a gun. And so you see how gun control and guns is probably the most obvious example of that debate between collective action rights and individual action and rights. For progressives, ideologically, everything is political. In other words, everything in the society should be used to further political goals. Of what? Of reform. That the government should reform society. Progressivism as an ideology critiques capitalism and private business as less efficient and even starts to argue is less moral than government action. And like I've said before, this gets at the heart of the debate between in Marxism, who should control the means of production, or who is a more efficient allocator of resources, of capital, of labor. Free market capitalism says that private enterprise, private business, the individual, is a more efficient allocator of resources, land, labor, natural resources. Whereas a more progressive or Marxist point of view argues that government is a more efficient manager of, to use the Marxist term, the means of production. Progressivism is generally considered left on the political spectrum as we generally define it today. I usually avoid using labels. I don't like to use labels a lot because then you have to explain the labels and people can disagree on the labels. But in general, the way that we as a modern day society define that left and right political divide, progressivism would be considered left on the political spectrum. More on the ideology of progressivism. In general, progressivism as a political ideology has a disdain or disrespect for traditional views on religion, morals, institutions, government. I'd like, say, the U.S. Constitution, the Ten Commandments. Progressivism, progress. So when somebody considers themselves progressive or progress, you get it? They look at things in the past as not as progressed or evolved, therefore they are bad. So you get it? So if you're progressive ideologically, you view current things as the best, and so anything in the past you kind of disdain or demean, or well, it's generally trash. Generally, progressives generally reject classical liberalism of the founding fathers and the European Enlightenment. And they generally have a disdain or disrespect for individual rights and liberty. What's more important for progressives is what is government reform. So your individual rights and your individual liberty should be given up in the name of government control or government reform to create a what? A utopia, a perfect society. Modern day American progressivism is much more statist and authoritarian than the classical liberals of the 18th and 19th century, and so that's why in general progressives, especially modern day American progressives, they reject or have a disdain for classical liberalism. It's progressivism is the intellectual ancestor for such concepts as modernism, humanism, moral relativism, eugenics, and modern American progressivism. Progressivism is the same intellectual environment as socialism, Marxism, and fascism. This idea that these progressive ideologies that call for the perfecting of society. The state is supreme. The state can create a utopia. The state can create new humans. In fascism, it's the perfect nationalist. In communism, it's the perfect worker. You create a perfect society where collective action is greater. So in both a fascist society and a communist society, individual rights are not just less important, but even immoral. Like, so for example, in a fascist society, you should give up your individual rights for the glory of the nation. In a communist society, you should give up your rights for the glory of the glory of the state to protect the proletariat. The American descendants of progressivism were FDR's New Deal, Truman's Fair Deal, Johnson's Great Society, and the New Left of the 60s, which we'll all talk about later. Some aspects of progressivism rejected social Darwinism, that society should be reformed. But other progressives said it is progressive to help evolution along, thus eugenics. And so within progressivism, you have some different strains, right? Some progressivism says, like social Darwinism in some ways says that you shouldn't reform society. You should let it evolve, right? The poor will die off, the weak, stupid, whatever, they'll all die off. Okay? So if you reform society, you help people that should be dying off. So some progressives look at that part of social Darwinism and say, no, you should reform society. You should get involved and help. Okay? And then out of that comes the eugenics movement where you're trying to help evolution along. So you get it? So for some, you do get involved with social Darwinism. You do get involved in society. You help society evolve. Help society evolve to create that new society, that perfect human. In communism, the perfect Soviet worker. In the fascist society, the perfect nationalist. Okay. And there's some benign forms of eugenics like birth control. There's some stark examples of eugenics, and which we'll talk about later in another lecture, World War II. So 21st century Americans, you and I, as 21st century, we tend to look at the 19th century with a lot of upset. The 21st century Americans are very upset with the 19th century, right? We want to tear down their statues. We want to cancel them. We want to rename everything. And, it's 21st century America is just very upset about the 19th century. It's very different. And so this part, what we're arguing is the progressive era is going to be a catalyst in changing society from the 19th to the 20th century to what you and I experience today. And this list here, these are examples of that. So, for example, science and religion. 19th century America is theistic. In other words, like 99.9999999% of Americans believe in a supreme being, a God, and all that. Okay, like everyone does. Okay, it's a very theistic society. If we went down to pre-Civil War America, took 10 Americans, put them in a room, and asked them, how did life begin on Earth? They'd quote to you Genesis 1-3 in the Holy Bible, right? So it's a very theistic society. Evolution and biblical criticism are going to secularize society to the point today where we take 10 Americans and I ask you about the origins of life on Earth. Even if you were a Bible believer, the book of Genesis, you still might quote me the theory of evolution. Okay. So 1859, Origins of the Species is published by Charles Darwin. And what does the theory of evolution argue? The theory of evolution argues that for the origins of life without God in the picture, right? Things happened randomly, things randomly came together and randomly created all these different forms of life. And so through mutation, adaptation, just kind of happened, right? Survival of the fittest. The theory is that nature always picks the correct sources, always picks the correct traits, or best traits, I mean. And so as the theory of evolution became more popular in American society, Americans are going to go from being a theistic society to a secular-minded society. Another aspect of the change between the 19th and 20th century religiously is higher biblical criticism. Okay. Pre-Civil War 19th century Americans you don't have a lot of questioning of Bible stories. In the early 20th century, or late 19th, early 20th century, you see American scholars, people doing a whole lot of questioning of the Bible. Is it possible to live inside a well for 3 days? Can you chemically change the properties of water to come up with wine? Can you raise the dead? All things the Bible says can happen. And so your society starts to ask questions, looks at the Bible as history. Who was the Pharaoh that had Hebrew slaves and then freed them, right? And so, where is there hieroglyphics that mention Moses and stuff like that? And so, as society, as late 19th, early 20th society critiques the Bible more and more, it causes a lot of society kind of lose their faith in the Bible, and you see kind of America becoming more of a secular society. Science and race, we talked about eugenics, helping evolution along. Okay. You and I would call it scientific racism. So, in the late 19th century, Charles Darwin was expounding his theory of evolution. Some scientists, European and American scientists, began to look at variations in the human family and sought to explain them in evolutionary terms. Why do we have all these differences in human beings? The most obvious is what? Race, right? Or skin color. So it's the most obvious way we can kind of tell the variations in human differences. In the late 19th century, some American and European evolutionists or biologists start to ask questions and determine, the different racial groups, where they fit on the evolutionary scale. And lo and behold, it turned out that Europeans are the most highly developed human beings, the most civilized, the most advanced, the smartest, the best, the strongest, the fastest, Uh, and so Europeans are the top of the evolutionary scale, right? You've looked at yourself, and lo and behold, you determined you're the most evolved, right? We're we're the most evolved toward the utopian society, right? And then you go down on the evolutionary scale, and for some 19th century scientists, people of African descent were the least evolved racial group, and so they are closer to our non-human ancestors, monkeys and apes. Okay, and so there are some people, some scientists during that era this is in textbooks, it's in science textbooks, right? That you go, well, this is racial groups on the evolutionary scale. Well, lo and behold, Europeans are the most advanced because Europeans are the one deciding who's the most evolved. And then people of African descent are argued to be at the bottom of the evolutionary scale, meaning closer to our non-human ancestors, which, according to Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, were descendants of chimpanzees, right? And so there you have that. And so it's one reason why it's really a horrible thing to do, to say to people, because at one time it was thought scientifically that may have been true. Okay. History, it's not a stretch. It's a little bit of an exaggeration, but not much, to say that 19th century Americans deified our founding fathers, deified them. Okay, revered them, respected, honored. Was there somebody that prayed to George Washington in the 19th century? Maybe. I mean, they deified the founding fathers. In the early 20th century, a historian named Charles A. Beard comes around. He's a pretty famous American historian. His most famous book was called An Economic Interpretation of the U.S. Constitution. And in that, Charles Beard argued argued against the noble reasons for the U.S. Constitution, and argued for more the more human aspects, that our founding fathers were, like the 60-odd men that we consider our founding fathers, they did happen to be among the richest men in America, the elite in American society, and so created a government that would, support them and serve their interests. And we're kind of shocked by this, but it's human nature, right? You're not gonna if you're in the position of creating government, you're not gonna create it to hurt you, right? You're gonna create it to protect your interests. And so Charles A. Beard's book, An Economic Interpretation of the U.S. Constitution, is going to greatly influence and change American attitudes about our founding fathers, where we're going to start to have more negative images of our founding fathers. One obvious example we could go over is, for example, did George Washington and Thomas Jefferson own slaves? Well, yes, they did. Did anyone care? Before in the 19th century, did anyone care? No, no one cared. Okay, no one worried about it. Do we care a lot today about it? Yes, we care a lot today about it. And so you have people, you have that change going on, where people are more willing to look at the founding fathers in a critical light. Another really obvious way to see the changes between the 19th and 20th century is to look at the Victorian ideal of womanhood, women between the 19th and 20th century. I usually ask my women students, have you ever been told you act like a lady? Okay, that kind of harkens back to the Victorian ideal of womanhood. 19th century America had a very set, and from our point of view, restrictive roles and ways of acting for women. A current day society would argue that they were restrictive. What is the Victorian ideal of womanhood, right? You're supposed to look a certain way. Long hair, curves. You're supposed to wear a corset, bra and corset to force your body into a certain shape. You're not supposed to smoke. That's dirty. No politics. That's dirty too. You're not supposed to like sex. That's dirty. You're not supposed to enjoy it. Prostitutes like sex, right? You're not supposed to do that. You're not supposed to like ask guys out, right? That's too forward. Okay, too forward. What had you better be on your wedding night? You'd better be a virgin on your wedding night. For the guy, it didn't matter so much, but definitely for the woman, si senor, you'd better be a virgin on your wedding night. Women are supposed to be, the Victorian ideal of womanhood, quiet, reserved, play, be coy, play hard to get. Okay, and those are all the act like a lady aspects. In the 20th century, in the 1920s, you see the 1920s flapper, and then when we get to the 1960s, we see feminism. And so, we'll look at the 1920s flapper, right? The 1920s flapper still wears a bra, but gets rid of the what? The corset. The 1920s woman votes, smokes, asks guys out, enjoys, the act of procreation. And so, you looking at women between, say, the 1890s, late 19th century, and the 20th century, it's a stark difference for that era. Professionalization of the occupations during the progressive era. Remember, progressives are looking for efficiency, and so kind of like government by experts, or people should know what they're doing, kind of thing. Another way to look at the differences between the 19th and 20th century is the difference in occupations. For example, in the 19th century, early 19th century, if you wanted to become a teacher, what did you do? You learned how to read, write, and do math. You might, travel with a teacher. Eventually, you get hired to teach. Okay. In the 19th century, and even before, if you wanted to be a doctor or a lawyer, what did you do? You started working with a doctor or a lawyer. Okay, and then you eventually became so well versed, you went ahead and were a lawyer. Okay, what do you got to do to be a teacher, doctor, lawyer today? You've got to go to school, get an education. You've got to, pass certain courses. Then you have to get certified and get a license. So professionalization of the occupations, what American society did in the early 20th century, is say, hey, for these occupations, we want experts, supposedly, and so we're going to set up a procedure by which you can do these jobs. So, for example, today, to be a teacher, doctor, lawyer, you have to have a degree, you have to have a license or certification, and you got to get license renewed. Okay, and so that's an example of professionalization of occupation. Going along with the idea that the middle class in America developed in the late 18th century, kind of woke up, discovered they were a class, and then they wanted to reform society. You have the development of the class system. They're the teachers, doctors, lawyers, factory managers. They're not working class. They don't work in the factory, or they're not factory workers. They don't own the factory, right? They're not wealthy. They don't own the factory, but they're the factory managers. They're kind of the middle. Economics in the 19th century, late 19th, early 20th century, socialism and communism, Marxism, came to America and were popularized. Eugene V. Debs, Jacob Riis, Upton Sinclair, writers, photographers, agitators from one point of view, kind of developed this acceptance of foreign economic systems. Government run by business, run by experts. In the late 19th, early 20th century, you see more of a desire. So government should be run by experts. So your postal worker should probably the person in charge of the post office should be in know how to handle the post office, stuff like that. Protect the, so there's four main goals of reformers, and then you can plug in individual laws and acts. Okay. Protect the social welfare. Those would be things like a minimum wage, homeless shelters, homeless assistance, stuff like that. Moral improvement would be things like temperance movement. Economic reform would be things like 8-hour workday, ending child labor laws. Child labor laws, which ended child labor. And then lastly, foster efficiency. Your example there would be the city manager plan of government for cities. You generally have four progressive amendments. The 16th Amendment granted Congress the power to tax income. This is viewed as a progressive reform because if you're going to greatly expand government power and the ability to interfere in people's lives, well, you got to have more money. The income tax is not constitutional. It was not in the original Constitution. So you have Congress passes a bill to send to the states for the 16th Amendment to pass. Then states go and ratify it. 17 was direct election of senators. 18th is the prohibition of selling or transporting alcohol. 19th is the federal women voting or suffrage. Muckrakers, we need to know what to reform. What's out there? What needs to be reformed, Mr. Bills? Muckrakers are writers, journalists, and activists who sought to expose the perceived ills and corruption in society. Some examples here are Ida Tarbell, History of Standard Oil, Shame of Our Cities by Lincoln Steffens, which covered city corruption, and then Upton Sinclair, The Jungle, which is a fictional work. But the argument was that Upton Sinclair went to work in the Chicago stockyards for a while and then used that information for a fictional book. Next, we're going to talk about state progressivism. At the state level, the 17th Amendment popular election of senators was an extremely big deal. For example, here in Nevada, a lot of populists and progressives argued that the Nevada state legislature and Nevada senators were under control of San Francisco banks and mine owners. They weren't representing the will of the Nevada people, but rather the interests of San Francisco bankers and mine owners. And so by having the 17th Amendment ratified for popular election of senators, you theoretically will get around the corruption. Are you regular people, regular voters? Are you in the back pocket of the moneyed interests? No, you're not. So theoretically, you'll pick a better choice for your Senate office. Next, as far as the state level, you have primary system. In the 19th century, you had corrupt fat cat. What you believe are corrupt fat cat party bosses sit in the back smoky room and decide who should be a candidate for office or not. The primary system allowed you regular voters to pick who you think the candidate should be 3 months later in the general election. And indeed, that's what we have today, right? For senators and representatives and president, months before election day in November, people are running a primary campaign, right? You got to win your primary. The initiative, referendum, and recall are also progressive reforms to give the voters more of a say in the legislative process. You consider the legislative process to be corrupt and ignoring your interests. So what do? You set up the initiative, referendum, and recall. The initiative and referendum are simply you get enough signatures together and you put the topic to a vote. Is the state legislature doing something you don't like? Is the state legislature not doing something you want done? What you do is you get enough signatures together. The governor calls a special election, and you have a special election based on, what the topic is. The recall. What if that's considered a progressive reform because you can get rid of the corrupt official earlier, right? What happens if you think the judge is corrupt? Okay, or what happens if you don't like what the judge is, like your judge is handing down the wrong opinions? So what can you do? You can have the recall. Get enough signatures together, get it on the ballot, and you can get on the ballot where the governor calls a special election. And then you you have your election. Next, we're going to talk about federal progressivism. Theodore Roosevelt, president from 1901 to 1909, is considered to be a progressive, president. Our first progressive president. Here's a political cartoon of a supporter of Theodore Roosevelt. It looks at kind of what he's going to do. He's going to rake the muck, right? There's a lot of corruption. There's a lot of things hidden. There's a lot of things going on with the elite establishment. Theodore Roosevelt argues, I'm going to take a big broom and we're going to reform Congress, right? We're going to get rid of the corruption. And so you see a political cartoon that kind of shows that. What's he going to do? What's Theodore Roosevelt's going to do? He's going to clean them up. He's going to clean out drain the swamp. He's going to drain the swamp in the deep state. The bully pulpit. Theodore Roosevelt termed the coin bully pulpit. What if there's a message I want to get out? I'm going to use my bully pulpit. People are going to listen to me because I'm the president. And so he was a strong debater. He was very interested in arguing a point of view and having you argue your point of view back. And so he claimed that's our bully pulpit. The square deal. Under Theodore Roosevelt, we have the square deal. And this is viewed as progressive reform because it sought to limit the power of trust, promote public health and safety, and improve working conditions. And so Theodore Roosevelt And so this is an example of, the square deal is an example of progressive reform because you have Roosevelt promising during his campaign in 1904 to see that each is given a square deal because he is entitled to no more and should receive no less. That's the whole idea of progressivism, that the government should actually provide this. The government should actually step in and provide you a square deal. The government should somehow enforce this. And so the square deal is an example of this progressive idea of reform. The government should step in and provide something for you, make things a certain way, determine outcomes. The biggest example of breaking up trust is the Sherman Antitrust Act. And again, you and I, you kind of breathe this as the second era that, you're okay with government regulating big business. And as I've said before, it was a very dramatic idea, a very radical idea in the late 19th, early 20th century that government should step in and actually tell a business what to do, regulate it or, tell it what to do. And this was a kind of a shocking, crazy idea during the time period. Roosevelt, the Sherman Antitrust Act was actually passed in the 1880s, but it was largely ignored until Roosevelt. Roosevelt used the Sherman Antitrust Act to go after corrupt monopolies. He didn't mind big companies; he minded corrupt monopolies, and so he went after those. And here's a political cartoon going after the bad trusts, and then who you get it? Who determines what's bad? Not the free market, capitalism, not private enterprise, but the government will determine, what's good and bad. Okay. And so Roosevelt saw the need for government to regulate large corporations. He assumed there was a need. And then here's a political cartoon, a really good one. So this is the argument of progressives, that corporate fat cats in the back are controlling the U.S. Senate. And so this is what progressives are arguing. They're arguing that we, the government, are protecting America, the regular people, from these corporate fat cats. Okay. Two other progressive reforms during Roosevelt's term. Wilson, Taft and Wilson's, the Clayton Antitrust Act passed in 1914, and then the Federal Trade Commission. Again, dramatic for the time period, but the progressive idea that government should step in and regulate private enterprise. Okay, you're saying that government's job to tell businesses what to do. Another example of the change in how progressivism changed kind of American cultural attitudes about things, the coal strike in 1902. We learned in previous lectures or lecture 2 especially, that what? Government in the 19th century always sided with management, right? Owners, okay? Business owners, corporations could always count on the support of government, okay? Progressive ideas is that government shouldn't be in a corner, but should either be neutral or on the side of workers. And so, for example, in the United Mine Workers strike in 1902, the Roosevelt administration jumps in, and rather than siding with corporations, the mine owners, calls for arbitration. You should sit down and negotiate labor peace. Okay. The Hepburn Act of 1906 gave the Interstate Commerce Commission the power to what? To set railroad rates. So you get it? This is a progressive reform. The idea that government is going to set railroad rates rather than private enterprise, or leaving it up to the market, right? Let the market decide. Okay? Progressives do not believe in that phrase, let the market decide. That's a free market, that's libertarianism, right? Free market capitalism, libertarianism, let the market decide. And so, you get it? So, progressives, the government should decide. Because the theory is the government is better able to make that decision than private enterprise. Or, the invisible hand, Adam Smith's invisible hand, that can slap you silly. The Northern Securities versus U.S. It established Roosevelt as a trustbuster, increased the power of his presidency, and it gave the president power to use government action to supposedly or allegedly benefit society. Okay. Next. Here's a fun political cartoon about a meat scandal. The story goes that Theodore Roosevelt was eating a steak lunch while reading Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, was horrified at the meatpacking industry, so immediately went in and got the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act passed. Again, the idea that government should step in and determine standards for meat and food products. Say things like, government, food companies should tell us their ingredients. What are they putting in things? The national park system is considered a progressive reform. In free market capitalism, use all of your resources. You're trying to make a profit, trying to provide a good service. So use all your resources, your natural resources. The national park system is a progressive reform that argued that you should set aside some of your land, regardless of the natural resources, for preservation, beauty, for people to visit, that and other reasons. Here's a map of the national park system in the late 19th century. You can kind of see where they all are. For Nevada history, Francis Newlands is a Nevada senator. You had the Newlands Reclamation Act. It authorizes the federal construction of dams and reservoirs out west. It also creates the Bureau of Reclamation. And so here you have it. So you get it? Instead of leaving land or the wilderness for private enterprise, free market capitalism, private enterprise to use natural resources to benefit America, create jobs and economic health and make America, energy independent, natural resource independent. You have government stepping in and saying what? Setting aside the land for other purposes. And so that's a progressive reform. The next president we want to talk about is William Howard Taft. He is considered progressive. He, compared to Theodore Roosevelt, Taft would be considered a more conservative progressive. Let's talk about him. Here's the election of 1908. William Jennings Bryan ran for president. As you can see, Nevada voted for William Jennings Bryan. However, William Howard Taft beat him. So you have that. You can see who voted for who. So progressive policies during the Taft administration created the Labor Department to enforce labor laws. Again, this is a change in how government relates to people, right? In the 19th century, more free market capitalism, what's sometimes called laissez-faire economics. It's not government's job. It's not government's job to tell a business, what to do with its labor. Okay, and so, but a more progressive idea says it is government's job to tell business what to do through labor laws, things like OSHA. During Taft's first term, his only term, we'll find out, but he had some problems. A lot of progressives didn't view him as progressive enough. He was a more conservative variety, right? He kind of lacked the charisma and energy he's a lot quieter and more reserved than Theodore Roosevelt. Taft fired the popular Gifford Pinchot, a very popular progressive as the United States Forest Service. And Taft signed the Payne-Aldrich tariff into law, which progressives of the era didn't like. And so you go to the election in 1912. The Republican Party nominated William Howard Taft. The Democrat Party nominated Woodrow Wilson. Eugene V. Debs, the socialist, this is one of the times he ran for president. Theodore Roosevelt, upset with Taft's failings as El Presidente, will throw his hat in the ring. This will split the Republican vote, and if I can skip real quick, it'll split the Republican vote, and you will get Woodrow Wilson as president. Nevada in 1912 voted for Woodrow Wilson. When we look at the election in 1912, we can see two different strains of nationalism. Theodore Roosevelt's new nationalism and Woodrow Wilson's new freedom. Okay? So you can kind of see competing forms of progressivism. Theodore Roosevelt's new nationalism was more energetic, more interventionist. Government should step in. It's the steward of the people. In other words, it's to look over, look after, take care of the people, and do things to them. For them. And so this new nationalism is this idea that, government is going to create this perfect society through government action and reform. Woodrow Wilson's new freedom is considered more conservative in that it doesn't go as far as, isn't as progressive as Theodore Roosevelt's new nationalism. New freedom was mainly banking reform. Didn't do a lot on social justice like the new nationalism did. For Wilson's new freedom, the goal was to create a level playing field, equal opportunity, where you could argue that Theodore Roosevelt's new nationalism not only wanted to create a new level playing field, but actually wanted to affect the result, determine winners and losers in the economy. So there's Woodrow Wilson. the third progressive president. So New Freedom in Action, the biggest aspect of New Freedom in Action is the Underwood Tariff, which you can read there. Substantially reduced tariffs. It was the first tariff reform since the Civil War. It's still protectionist, but a lot more progressive. Woodrow Wilson was big on banking reform. The biggest banking reform of the early 20th century is the Federal Reserve Act. The argument is that corporate fat cats, the Wall Street casino, as Bernie Sanders says, the corporate fat cats, the money interests, they control the money supply. They control the gold. So the argument for the Federal Reserve Act is to break up the monopoly of money, the monopoly of these moneyed interests by creating a Federal Reserve System, a system of reserve banks throughout the country, so that money could flow better throughout the economy. Okay? And so the Federal Reserve Act was supposed to reduce panic. Interesting. It was supposed to even out the highs and lows of a capitalist economy. It's in response to we've already kind of gone over it. There was an economic depression in the 1870s, and then again in the late 1880s and 90s, right? The Federal Reserve Act is supposed to either stop depressions from happening or greatly reduce their severity. Well, thank goodness. I was hoping there wouldn't be another depression. It was also supposed to protect the value of your dollar as well. It is interesting to note that the U.S. dollar, in the century that the Federal Reserve has existed, it's interesting to note that the dollar has lost 99% of its value. Not only was Woodrow Wilson interested in lowering tariffs, he wanted to create a graduated income tax that was more progressive. In other words, you'd have higher income earners paying more than lower income earners. Like I said, there's the Federal Reserve Act. The Federal Trade Commission was supposed to regulate interstate commerce. So again, interesting. Remember, so you're saying that the government is the more efficient allocator of resources than trade, whereas the free market capitalism will say you don't need the Federal Trade Commission. Adam Smith's invisible hand will guide the market, through to get things where they belong efficiently. As we talked about earlier, the Clayton Antitrust Act was meant to strengthen the government's ability to go after unions. And here you can see a political cartoon. And then you have the Underwood Tariff, established an income tax 1% to $20,000. It dropped the average tariff rate from 41% to 27%. And for incomes above $500,000, there's going to be a 7% of income tax. Thank you for listening to History 102, Lecture 5, The Progressive Era.